5, 4, 3, 2, 1, watch me.
You blitz all night. And if they cross the line of scrimmage, I'm going to take every last one of you out.
Hey, the blitz is coming, boys.
What's going on? Welcome back to The Blitz. I am your host, William Spencer, and this show is to provide our viewers with the latest and greatest in news, tips, tricks, and advice to get you ready for your fantasy football season in just 5 minutes or less. Now, I saw an interesting post on X ranking the wide receivers of the NFC East, so I thought, why not flip it for fantasy football? So in today's episode, I'm ranking the NFC East top wide receivers in order ahead of the 2025 fantasy season. Who knows? I might have to do this for the rest of the divisions around the NFL. Now that I think about it, might just have to do that. But before we jump into the episode, make sure that you're following the Fantasy's Finest YouTube channel for the latest episodes on The Blitz. You can also find The Blitz in audio format on your favorite podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to like, share, and comment on the podcast episode if you are feeling it, because it helps us find out what you guys like, and it helps grow the channel via the algorithm. So let's get into the episode and see who's the top dog for the NFC East for fantasy football this coming season. So, coming in at number 4, it's Washington Commanders wide receiver Terry McLaurin. Yeah, I know. This may come as a shock to some, but Scary Terry slides in as my number 4 wide receiver of the top guys in the NFC East. While McLaurin did finish as the wide receiver 7 in fantasy football last season, he averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game over the year. That average has him at dead last when compared to Ceedee Lamb, A.J. Brown, and Malik Nabers. McLaurin also finished 3rd in targets among the NFC East top wide receivers last season, despite playing more games. And he likely would have finished last in targets had Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown played the entire season while averaging nearly 8 targets per game. Now, McLaurin has even more competition for targets coming in this season with Michael Gallup and Deebo Samuels now on the roster. Terry McLaurin is still a good fantasy option, but among these other guys in the same division, he's just not on their level. Coming in at the number 3 spot is Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown. Yes, I know Brown is a dog, and I know he's been more than viable for fantasy football. But make no mistake, the Eagles' offense runs through Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts on the ground. Brown saw his production take a hit in 2024 with his targets, receptions, and receiving yards all down from his top 5 fantasy finish in 2023. Despite averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game in 2024, Brown would finish as the wide receiver 20 in total fantasy points and outside the top 12 in fantasy points per game among wide receivers. Now, Brown is a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL. There's no doubts about that. But Brown also dealt with injuries last season that forced him to miss 4 games, hurting his fantasy value. But the dramatic dip in targets is a concern. Brown saw 140 plus targets in his last 2 seasons before 2024, and at 7.5 targets per game, he would have finished around 130 targets. The Eagles are so run focused that it's hurting the Eagles passing game for fantasy football. Brown is still going to see a substantial target share in the Eagles offense, and he is a strong wide receiver too for fantasy managers to target this year. But because of the amount of work the other remaining receivers can get, I have to keep Brown at number 3. Now, coming in at number 2, and honestly, this was a bit of a tough one, is Giants wide receiver Malik Nabers. Nabers exploded onto the scene during his rookie season and absolutely destroyed my takes on him for fantasy football. Nabers finished as the wide receiver 6 in fantasy football, averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game, ranking 1st among the wide receivers in the NFC East in 2024. Now, Nabers led all NFC East receivers in targets in 2024 and now gets paired with one of the best rainbow-throwing deep ball passers in the NFL in Russell Wilson. Nabers' high target share should be a thing in 2024 with a tough schedule over the first quarter of the season alone, forcing the Giants to throw the ball to stay in the games. Nabers has the volume and skill set to be even more dangerous than he was last season, and he has a quarterback that can get him the ball downfield more frequently. Considering the other wide receivers behind him, Nabers should once again command a strong target share for 2025, easily making him one of the top fantasy wide receivers to come off the board in the early rounds. But now the top fantasy wide receiver is here. Coming in at the top spot is Cowboys wide receiver Ceedee Lamb. Now, despite losing Dak Prescott for the season behind a hamstring injury and even getting his season cut short because of a late season shoulder injury, Lamb is my top fantasy wide receiver for the NFC East. Yes, the Cowboys did trade for former Steelers wide receiver George Pickens, and while the thought of Lamb losing targets is certainly possible, it's not likely. Pickens can absorb targets left over from Jalen Tolbert and Brandon Cooks to not even bother Lamb's share. Lamb will also be even more dangerous now that defenses will have to concern themselves with Pickens on the other side of the field. And while some may believe that Malik Nabers should be the number one guy, and I'm looking at you Giants fans, Lamb can easily overtake Nabers' production. Last season, Lamb and Nabers were nearly neck and neck in various statistical categories. For example, Nabers averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game. Ceedee Lamb, 17.6. Nabers' catch rate in 2024, 64%. Lamb, 66%. Malik Nabers' receiving yards, 1,204. Lamb, 1,196. You see where I'm going? Lamb is locked in as a top 4 wide receiver to be drafted in fantasy football this season. Now that Dak is healthy and the Cowboys want to get the run game going again, it's just a better situation for Ceedee Lamb to be in. But that's my rankings for the wide receivers in the NFC East. Let me know what you think in the comment sections wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast episode. But that will wrap it up for this episode of The Blitz. Make sure that you're subscribed to the Fantasy's Finest YouTube channel or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, so you don't miss the latest show. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.
Yo, come back now, you hear?